So it was a sweeping commentary on the book, and I would really suggest you to read the book because of first the expansive references and bibliography that she refers to in the book. It is just amazing. And then when we learn Islamic history in school, in primary and in secondary school, in the Malaysian education, it is a compulsory subject to learn Islamic education.
Oh.
So for Muslims, it is compulsory for us to learn that in our school system. So when we learn that, we are being portrayed an image of the Sahaba. But we are not being taught to be critical about whether these images has been there because of prejudices or because or are these images are in accordance to the earlier sources. So this book will offer you an analysis of that. Okay, so I think I'll take 3 questions first from the audience. Now please raise your hands if you would like to ask any question to our 2 professors.
Thank you, Prof. Asma, for very interesting, I would put it as an overview of the book. Yes. And what I'm going to ask is also related to some of the things which you've already mentioned, but perhaps you could give some extra elaboration, because just to mention here that I've yet to have the opportunity to read the book,
Okay.
and I'm sure that I'm going to explore it in sometime soon. Okay, the question I put it in a simple way first, which is what is the difference between the Islam we as the current moment Muslims, we generally put it, we currently follow with the Islam that is being lived by the earlier generation or the first Muslims. That is in a simple way, but I would like to add up the reason for me asking this. So if we put into some comparison, I'll just start with the first Muslim. We would understand that during this earliest generation of Muslims, there's very strong elements of Islam with a revolutionary and progressive nature. What I mean by progressive is not meaning to say progressive in progressive values as we usually understand now. Progressive as being tolerant, as being liberal, not like that. But what I mean by progressive is we understand the construction of Islam itself is in a way is an expansion. It's dynamic. It builds up society while at the same time the theology is being constructed, and to some point it is powerful. Meaning to say powerful that while at the same time the idea of religion is being received by the followers, they are at the same time expanding politically, building up societies, coming up with very important reforms, not just within a small community. We understand that Islam flourished within 100 years to almost, I don't know, 1/3 or almost half of the world, right? So it's very important phase at that time. That's what I mean by progressive. If you want to compare to Muslims now, in fact, I see current Muslims, we are in a way stagnant, we are in some way backward, and conservative in the sense that we are not pro-reform, we are not pro-towards, we don't embrace or celebrate changes in the way we live and we understand the word itself. So it relates to, that is why the reason I asked about the difference between, could it be the Islam that we understand now is perhaps different with being practiced, being lived and being believed before. Just to add up another point is relates to what I got from the book by Shah Ahmad, one of his critics, when he explained that he categorized the way Muslims believe into 2 categories. One, he called it the prescriptive, the second as the explorative. Meaning that the prescriptive as if we assume, I would relate it to how do we Muslims at the current time believe Islam or live Islam as something as an full set of idea and system, as you mentioned before, that Muslims are expected just to follow because the complete and the perfect Islam is already there, being constructed by the previous scholars. While another way which he explained is explorative, is we understand and we live Islam as a continuous construction and experience. Why this is different is that when we understand it's an exploration and we continuously try to reset up and reconstruct the way we live Islam and by being Muslim, it involves a lot of creativity, dedication and commitment to our religion itself. To upon using your own term, we understand that Islam, our life as being a Muslim and Islam is always a continuous work in progress. and it also relates to, it is a continuous way of improving our life. So just to summarize my question is, when it comes to when I asked about the difference between the two generations, how could this difference be? One maybe in terms of the conception of Islam itself, could it be any difference there? The way the Muslims believe, it's not just about Islam, but how do the Muslims believe, right? And how does that also relate to the ethical and the action part of the Muslims?
Some of these points I'll get to tomorrow. I think tomorrow I'm talking about the future of Islam. But, okay, so there's always going to be a prescriptive element to Islam or any religion, right? Every religion has its core of truth claims and certain required practices. So I think the distinction that I made between ibadat and mu'amalat, that's not very original, but that's foundational, right? So on matters of worship, about prescriptions regarding, how to pray, how to relate to God, and basically the 5 pillars, right? The arkanuddin are not negotiable. They define a Muslim. But beyond that, we're talking about life, right? With all its complications and messiness and everything. So when you say, what is the difference between the Islam practice in the 1st century and Islam practice? So that question then assumes that there was one monolithic Islam being practiced in the 1st century and one monolithic Islam being practiced now, right? That's of course not true. There are many different interpretations of Islamic principles, different cultures that grew up around Islam, but sometimes very different from one another, right? They showed the local inflection. One thing Islamic law always recognized was the importance of urf, of custom. And that always entered into legal interpretation. And that has to be an important element because the larger social context determines how law is to be interpreted and applied, right? There's that famous example of Shafi'i when he moves from Baghdad, from Iraq to Egypt. He basically threw out his old law book and said, I'm going to write a whole new usulul fiqh, given my new circumstances. And he was absolutely right in doing that, right? If there's one thing that I could point to is, I think, absolutely what you said in your own elaboration of your question, the creativity. The creativity is missing, the flexibility, the dynamic thinking. Why is that? Well, there are lots of political reasons, and I think people who study the political situation would be more capable of answering that question, and also it would have to be culture specific. In other words, there's no single pat answer that would necessarily describe the situation, the very complex situation of Muslims in very different parts of the globe, right? You would have to sort of look at those specific circumstances to be able to come up with a very coherent answer. Education, honestly, the illiteracy of Muslims concerning their own heritage and their own religion is astounding. It's just astounding. And I think this is where Muslims are most vulnerable on. They've really lost sight of their larger heritage. They don't have that sense of being embedded in their own history. The colonial period represented a sharp rupture from what went before, and that's why we talk about the post-colonial period as being particularly problematic, right? This is not a new observation on my part. Many people have made this observation. And again, I think it's a question of reconnecting with that past. Now, it's very interesting. I think recent documentation, recent surveys have shown that actually students coming out of a madrasa education tend to be much more pluralistic and inclusive in their worldview. Have you heard that or read reports of that sort? The reason being, and I'm talking about a genuine madrasa education where you're exposed to many of the sources and you read all kinds of things. So you're not just being fed a line, all right? You're not being indoctrinated. You're not towing an ideological line. I'm talking about engaging the Islamic tradition, all its diversity and richness, and reading about all the different schools, the madhahib, but reading about Shiaism, but also reading about groups that fell out over history, but nevertheless, their contributions live on, right? We talk about the 4 madhahib now, but there are almost 50, I think, in its heyday. There were a multiplicity of legal schools or legal trends that died out, right? Tabari had its own madhab for a while that didn't survive. I mean, we know the 4 that did. The whole point of this is that if you become severed from that history, then you have no sense of who you are and how you fit in that overall history. So I think Shahab Ahmed did a great service by pointing to this internal diversity and pluralism that have typically existed in Islamic societies, and that there is no single definition of a Muslim. There is the minimalist definition, right, that you have to say the Shahada, but after that you're supposed to leave that person alone. You're not supposed to go around, ideally, instituting all kinds of litmus tests to prove your Muslimness, right? Because that's just so dangerous. And I actually think it's very anti-Islamic, very anti-Quranic, where the whole ethos is, we were talking about this earlier, right? That there is no coercion in religion, of course. And there's that famous hadith that once you utter the shahada, you're to be left alone. You're to be accepted as a Muslim for all purposes, right? That's not how Islamic history necessarily played out. We have, of course, plenty of evidence of instituting all kinds of litmus tests and people going around assessing, you know, how good a Muslim someone was. There is where we find our cautionary tale that when you do betray those, I think, fundamental principles of non-coercion, and the Quran itself is very explicit about how God alone knows what's in your heart, and that He will adjudicate the differences, the theological differences that do crop up in real life. But humans are not supposed to do that, right? That's why the Quran actually doesn't mandate a punishment for apostasy. There is no punishment in the Quran for apostasy. There is condemnation of it, but only God can judge. So it is a return to the sources. I'm going to sound like a bad Protestant here, right? Almost like sola scriptura, go back to the sources. But I can't emphasize that enough. I think because we have lost touch with that very important period of our lives. Now, no one is saying that you have to go back to the past in order to replicate it. That's the problem with the way some people have been approaching the past. I often say, if you're going to distill the difference in approach between modernists and liberals and the hardline Islamists to the past, you can distill it this way. Modernists or liberal Muslims will often ask the question, why? Why did the early Muslims act in a certain way? What was the animating principle behind it? Typically, hardline Islamists will say, how did they do it? They want to replicate it. So, to give a bad extreme example, I guess, the Wahhabis are everyone's favorite whipping boy, right? But I mean, they're very concerned with the length of their tunics, right? The length of their beard. So a lot of it has to do with how did the Prophet look? How did the companions look? What did they wear, right? But it's not so much about why did they behave the way they did? All right, so you can't replicate that action perhaps, but what was the moral behind it, right? What was the larger ethical principle behind their behavior? So those are the kinds of questions I think that Muslims should be asking in the present time, that you're trying to retrieve the ethos of that period and not replicating necessarily how things were actually done, the mechanisms of doing those actions, but the principles underlying a certain kind of behavior or belief. Okay. I hope that begins to answer your question, but you asked a very big question. But I think those questions need to be asked.
Yeah. My question is that I think one of the problem of contemporary Muslim is we do not have enough creativity in engaging with our classical sources. There is a disturbing trend among Malaysian men, I mean, at least in my circle, which, not you, outside, another circle. I have like 5 or 6 circles, just to save myself. Okay, there is a disturbing trend that we can see in the social media, and even in popular media. When I commute to work, I will listen to the popular Malay radio channel, and they always make jokes about polygamy. All right, so the assumption, the prevalent assumption among Malay men is that polygamy is a right that can be used by Muslim men, which I find it disturbing. So yes, it is in the Quran, but it is also stated in the Quran in a very specific manner. It is not a right for man if we understand it carefully. So, this is also related to how we view women. And you explain in the book that how Muslims view women changed from the first 3 generations of Muslims and during the Mamluk period. So, could you explain further on how the socio-political condition of the Mamluk period changed the way Muslims see women until it reflected in the attitude of the Muslims in general?
Yeah, and I refer to Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah in particular. He wrote a book simply called the Kitab al-Nisa, I think, the Book of Women. And he talks about how it's always preferable for women to be in their homes. If she should go out, she always should ask permission of her male guardians. But he also talks about how she should always make herself so indistinct and almost invisible to the people on the street, right? And then you have to ask, where is he getting these notions from? Because you actually never see that in the early sources. There was always an assumption that women had the right to be in the public sphere, right? When I give my talk on women, I'm going to start with the mention of Al Maraa, whom some of you may already know about, and I do mention her in the book. One of the celebrated women companions who actually took part in battle alongside the Prophet. And in fact, in one battle, she was key to protecting him from the attacks of a very aggressive pagan man from Quraysh. And he praised her fulsomely and said, you have been the best warrior on the battlefield today. And if you go, that's in Ibn Sa'd's version of Al Maraa's life. You go to Ibn Hajar's book, Biographical Dictionary, which has been composed during the Mamluk period. And Ibn Sa'd's, I don't know how many paragraphs on Al Maraa has shrunk to maybe about 2 paragraphs, right? And he kind of almost grudgingly mentions the fact that she had been out on the battlefield and protected the Prophet and everything. Why? Well, we can only speculate. Of course, in times of political turmoil, one of the first things you want to do is to make sure that you batten down the hatches, you circle the wagons, and you make sure that you can control the things you can control, and so that not everything will be spinning out of control in your life. And so one of the easiest realms to control is the domestic realm, right? So you can justify it by saying these are strange and unusual times, and therefore we need to be much more vigilant about what goes on in our homes, the behavior of our women, and so forth, right? Culture wars often get fought on the bodies of women. To this day, it happens to be true everywhere in the world. So I would see that as probably the most important factor. Now, I would also take everything that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah says in his book with a huge grain of salt. Just because Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah is saying all these things doesn't mean that it reflects the reality of the time. It may be just the opposite. And in fact, we have historical works written during the Mamluk period that show that women were very active at that time. They were conducting successful businesses, cottage industries out of their own homes. Oftentimes today we tend to think of all meaningful economic activity to take place only in the public sphere, right? In the medieval world, in the pre-modern world, you didn't have this distinction between private and public, right? Oftentimes, household businesses were the most important source of economic activity, and they took place inside the home, and men and women were equally involved. So we know that women were actually running very successful businesses. This was not necessarily to the liking of everybody. Some very conservative theologians, and I would count Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah to be among them, that one of the ways he wanted to push back against this was by writing manuals that dictated a certain kind of behavior for women. So I call this a wish list. This is the world that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah wishes existed, but does not. So paradoxically, I think what works like that show is that women were actually unusually active in the period, which necessitated these kinds of manuals to be written to try and stave off, right, these kinds of changes that these very conservative theologians didn't like and wanted to put a stop to.
But the problem is some of our people now,
Yes.
Muslims now,
Yeah.
regard this manual as the truth.
Okay. So who do you think hardline Islamists are reading? Ibn Sa'd or Ibn Hajar?
Ibn Hajar.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I read some of their works to realize that they're almost invariably citing Mamluk sources. Other than Ibn Hajar, of course, there's the famous Ibn Taymiyyah, right? Ibn Taymiyyah is writing his militant works against the Mongols. You take his remarks out of context and you assume that he means that to be applied to all non-Muslims in general, but really his animus was reserved for the Mongols because they had driven him out of his home and they had caused unusual hardship in his own life, right? So he reserved this particular wrath and rancor against the Mamluks because of what they'd done to his family. Because at this,
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we have one question over there.
Over history, you find all sort of reactions to other societies, powers or maybe empires towards Islam. Tragically, now we have a great deal of phobia about Islam. Could you like enlighten us over history on these perspectives? How has it changed? Was it like this from the beginning?
Islamophobia you're talking about?
I mean,
in general?
did other societies have this fear of Islam as what we are seeing today?
Yeah.
I mean, we've lived through the Spanish Inquisition, we've lived through the Crusades, the Mongol invasion. I mean, so many things that's happened over history.
Yeah.
How has
The main difference, of course, is the rise of social media, which is why it seems so much more ubiquitous, that it's all around us. And that kind of phobia, and specifically Islamophobia, can be disseminated so easily among the general public, right? And then we have, of course, broadcast media, we have television. I don't know if you've heard of a notorious TV station in the US, the Fox News station. Yes? You're nodding your head. You've actually heard of them? That's scary. It's not just restricted to the US. If you watch, actually, I've never had the stomach to watch any one of their programs in their entirety. I just have to watch a little bit to get a sense of what they're spewing out practically every day, right? So it's not surprising that there are people in contemporary American society who do not have access to alternate sources of information, that they buy that message, right? And therefore Muslims are to be regarded with fear, with hatred, because they're innately dangerous. They're just violent people. There's nothing redeeming about them. I developed a course last semester called The Middle East and the Western Imagination. So that required me to actually look at some pre-modern materials, and especially from the medieval period. And one consistent image of Muslims persisted through much of the medieval period in Europe, and that is of Muslims as monsters. They were often depicted as just scary, bestial characters, often in the shape of a dog. I don't know if that's because they were aware that Muslims do consider dogs to be unclean, and so it would make sense to conflate them with a creature they themselves hold to be unclean. So there are these graphic images. I won't even start about how some of these sources depicted the Prophet Muhammad, right? There's one ghastly one that all of us were shocked when I put it out there, and I think it showed, the Prophet Muhammad, the raping the Virgin Mary in one depiction of the afterworld or something. Pretty gross, pretty gross. However, I'm sure most Europeans at that time were not even aware of Muslims, right? And so they probably had no conception of Islam or Muslims. Unlike today, where, if you generate these images and, graphic depictions of Muslims as monsters or, constantly murdering people, think of the cartoons, right? The cartoon controversy. Yeah, they get disseminated so fast so that the public, the reading public, or the television viewing public in any given country quickly gets wind of these things. So that does make the sentiment much more widespread than it would have been in the medieval period. So there are antecedents to the kind of rampant Islamophobia that we see spreading in the US, but also in Europe. And I'm sure you've heard about the horrible situation in France, for example, vis-a-vis Muslims, and particularly Muslim women, right, who are being discriminated against just for wanting to wear the hijab in public places and in official.
Not only in Europe, we get it all over the world now. China, India.
And China is starting to crack down. That's right. And so the contagion is spreading.
So it's just that over history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not something new. It's always been a threat.
It's not something new.
Something to be, demonized.
And sometimes it lays dormant, and then certain things will happen in the, in the social and political sphere, and it triggers those, symbols again.
What was this fear about?
Well, there's nine.
How would you see that?
What's triggering the current Islamophobia?
What was this fear over history about Islam? What were they afraid of?
I think during the medieval period it was the political expansion.
Well, Islam was always seen as a rival to Christianity in terms of empire, in terms of land, in terms of conversion.
Empires. They're competing for land and power.
Yeah, and souls of people. And so,
I mean, in some ways one could argue that Europeans or European governments were rightly afraid. Right, and the Islamophobia, if we want to back project that word, is really just political rhetoric against. It's just political rhetoric against an enemy, right? Because borders are shifting and people are. I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that Islam was an imperial power. It was a conquest, right? It was a conquering power, and Christianity was also. So, I mean, I think there's lots of that. Although I don't, the same kind of imagery, while it was. You can find some of it in Islamic sources, but not as much.
Well, you cannot denigrate Christianity to that extent because Islam does actually recognize Christianity.
Yeah.
You cannot say
it was easier for the
derogatory things about Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus is a prophet within Islam, right? So you couldn't have it to that extent. So political rival, but I mean, don't forget also a rival for the souls of people. The idea was that you want to convert as many people to your religion than the other competing religion, right? So I guess two ancient rivals jostling for preeminence and seeing each other as a threat. It plays out differently in the Muslim world just because Christianity is recognized as a religion, and you certainly cannot malign Nabi Aisha, right, who's a Rasulullah. So there are all those elements.
Two popes ago, now I think it might be three. There was actually a concern about Islam and the growing number of Muslims, even though secularization has taken hold so strongly in Europe.
Yeah, they wanted to.
Many people are not connected to their religion except for formal occasions, birth, marriage, death. But the very presence of so many Muslims worrying the Catholic Church. And this brings up all the history of the Muslim conquest into Europe, of trying to keep Europe kind of Christian. And so when you have leaders like the Pope even speaking and bringing up these old images, because they're worried about the changing nature of the culture. It's like fear of immigrants, right? And it's fear of immigrants in the US, it's fear of immigrants in Europe. Almost like you were going to see a revival of, which I don't think we're going to, but almost a revival of Christianity in the face of a growing Muslim presence.
But only as a symbol.
Exactly. It's a cultural background.
Because, I mean, I can't see the French and the Germans and the Danes going back to actually embracing Christianity as a religion to be practiced, but mainly as this is what defines us.
Against you.
And that's what defines you, and we are not like you. So it's really a strategy of drawing more rigid boundaries around us so that we don't get blended with those people there.
And you wonder why the Muslims then can't integrate and assimilate into Europe, because of some of those very added, I mean, so
it's worse in Europe, and people have pointed to the US as sort of a counterexample of what can happen when a society is more receptive, and Muslims are far better integrated into American society than they are in various European societies, and also because there's such constant pushback against them, right? So it's a complex answer, but I would agree with you that there were always elements of that. It's, however, muted into, morphed into something much more pervasive and much more dangerous. Technology has been a big aid. It's just, that message reaches so many more people, so that more people will become galvanized by this kind of rhetoric, as we saw in the last US elections, than it was possible in the medieval period. Now, what I was trying to get to is that there are also, let's not forget that there are people of goodwill on both sides, however, who are trying to push back against this hate mongering and baiting of immigrants, right? There was a film that was produced in the US by, and I'm drawing a blank on the producer, he's very well known for not Michael Wolff, because that's the guy who wrote The Fire and the Fury, right?
Obsession?
No, I'm talking about a good film that tries to spread goodwill.
Right.
Anyway, he made a movie about St. Francis, because there's this popular story that St. Francis of Assisi actually went to the Mamluk king at that time, during the time of the Crusades, and wanted to effect a rapprochement, a one-man initiative. The contemporary Arabic Islamic sources don't mention him, but apparently in some of the European chronicles, this is mentioned. So it's fired the imagination of certain people saying, look, here's a positive example of how at least one noble Christian tried to rise above the rhetoric of the Crusades and attempted to build bridges with the Muslims. So there's been a whole film made about it. I haven't watched it. It caused quite a bit of sensation, by the way, in the US when it opened. And I would love to show it on my campus. I think one of these days, even bring the producer over just to ask him what motivated him to do it. Undoubtedly, this current atmosphere of Islamophobia is a big motivating factor for him, and that he wanted to show that there were a few people of goodwill, but these people are always flying under the radar. We don't hear about them. History doesn't record their deeds and motivations, but he would like to celebrate this attempt to, at least an attempt to build a bridge of understanding, right? So I think it's also important for us to realize that it's not one unrelenting narrative of hate mongering, that even now there are people who are trying to push back against this and try to build instead bridges of compassion, of goodwill. I hope they succeed, but the forces of hate are far more stronger right now, but that could change.
Yeah, Gallup did a poll about this in the US and in Europe, and one of the things that they showed was that, especially in the US, is that so many people have never met a Muslim. They don't have Muslim neighbors. And so their information about what Islam is coming from thoughts and from their churches, which in some cases just spout some of this false information. There are so many people who are afraid for absolutely no reason, and if they had a Muslim neighbor, they would say, hey, guess what? They're concerned about the same things that everyone else is, keeping the lawns mowed, paying your house payments and raising your kids in education, but they don't know.
Normal people.
Normal people.
Yeah.
But they don't. But the good part of it is that the more people had exposure to Muslims, the less antagonistic they were.
This is study that
This was a poll.
There's a polling data that showed.
Was it Gallup or Pew?
It's Gallup.
It's Gallup.
It was a Gallup one that was done both in the U.S. and in Europe. And in other words, the distance allows some of these strange ideas to seep in about what the other is, I think.
Yep.
And allows them to take hold. And there are, unfortunately now, I think there are organized efforts, and there have been for the past 20, 25 years, of organizations that are promoting a very anti-Muslim and anti-Islam perspective, using converts, people who have converted out of Islam into another religion, as the people who are going to represent Islam. It's kind of a frightening scenario that people fall for that. They wouldn't fall for it for their own religion, but they fall for it for Islam. And these are the people who are the Muslim heroes, are the ones who have converted away from Islam into Christianity and are there to tell about what the real Islam is.
And they're presented as, ironically, presented as enlightened Muslims,
Exactly.
even as to leave Islam.
It's embarrassing,
yeah.
but it's convincing to those who want to hear it and want to believe, yes, because they're converting out of Islam, my religion must be better. And it's just feeding into this strange narrative, unfortunately.
So these websites are extremely powerful sources.
Of power. You know, like now we have the nation-state systems, and the perspective through the perspective of power, when we look at religion. What are your comments on that?
But the relationship between religion and power, what kind of power?
Yes.
And where? I mean, you have to be a bit more specific, because, I mean, that can be answered in so many different ways, right?
Yeah, okay, like for example, currently in the global system, you have a hegemon, you have the United States, and it is the world power now. And the policies that it will have has impact on the rest of the world, you see. For example, the global war on terror, you see, it has impact and it on religion as well. So what are your views on that?
Well, the global war on terror, and there's been this war of terminology, by the way, between the Obama administration and the current Trump administration. Trump, from day one, was saying things like, Islam has declared war on us. Islam is our enemy. And he would constantly pepper his speeches with the radical Islamic terrorism and how important it is to fight it, right? The Obama administration consciously made an attempt to not use inflammatory phrases like that. They used rather extremist religion. What was their preferred term? Radical extremism, I think, but they didn't necessarily equate it with religion.
They weren't even going to use the word Islam
They
in
would,
the phrasing.
They would not use it. Yeah, if they used religion at all, it would be in a kind of a broad, generic way, right? And so Trump kind of made it sort of part of his campaign that he would identify the enemy as it should be identified, and that we should call it what it should be called, and therefore his preferred term was radical Islamic terrorism, trying to underline the fact that it is Islam that we're fighting, and Islam breeds terrorism, so no wonder there is such a thing as Islamic terrorism, right? So what you choose to call things, of course, matters quite a bit. The so-called war on terror has been criticized by a number of people, and I think for good reason.
It's institutionalized.
It's institutionalized, but then
the global institutions.
Yeah.
You have states aligning, towards the American positions. For example, we have Saudi Arabia, which actually aligns itself.
Can we have that as the last question, please? We are running out of time.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Aligning itself with the United States. And now what's happening is that Saudi Arabia is in fact attacking another Muslim country. So, I mean, these are the custodians of the holy mosques. And you're attacking another Muslim country, and killing Muslims, which, and inside the Quran, you say if you just kill one Muslim, it's like,
kill one human being. One human being, yeah.
One human being is
any human being.
Humanity. And now you have a state, the custodians of the holy mosques, going around and attacking another Muslim state, let alone any state, but being Yemen being a Muslim state.
So one of the criticism about the whole phraseology, war on terror, because it was always implied on it that you were talking about Islamic terror, that you're talking about terrorists who happen to be Muslims, because that's the only kind of terrorists you have. So one of the main criticisms leveled at that use of terminology was that you basically handing it over to recruiters for Daesh and for other militant groups, because that's what they want. They actually want the West to label Muslims and Islam as the enemy. Then they can say, look, the West is actually out to destroy us, right? Join us, we will help you to combat these people, right? That's one very important criticism, I think, leveled against the usage of that term. The other issue that you're bringing up is very recent, and here I think I begin to see what you meant by religion and power. Absolutely. So when religion is being instrumentalized by governments like the Saudi Arabian government and so forth, it's a mechanism for staying in power and maintaining the status, the political status quo, right? They're extremely afraid of what happened in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. They're afraid of pro-democracy movements. And there are pro-democracy movements in some of these countries that they would love to see go away. And so they can use terrorism, the rise of militancy, as a bludgeon to squash these populist movements, right? And therefore to maintain their power. So here we have an unhealthy wedding between religion and power in order to maintain their status quo. But this is not new in history. This has happened before. Religion has always been instrumentalized by those in authority, right, to protect their own interests. You see this replicated over and over again. And that's the example you point to is, I think, the most recent example of how using religion, you can actually go against some of the basic principles that those religious traditions call for. You see it right now, of course, in Trump's America, right? Where Christian leaders are embracing someone like Trump, whom they should actually regard with utter contempt and repugnance, but they don't, because it's a marriage of convenience. Same thing with Saudi Arabia now getting into bed with America, with inviting Jared Kushner all the time as an emissary. Who would have thunk, right, that this would have happened a decade ago? It would have been impossible, but here we are. And this is what this unhealthy marriage between religion instrumentalized for the benefit of those who are in power and having considerable political power to wield can result in.
It's just my hypothesis, but because the topic is about the first Muslims, I reckon, this is my hypothesis, I reckon why we're having this problem nowadays in learning or understanding about the pious predecessors, it has something to do with the state of Saudi Arabia, because it's the way that they're trying to rewrite history. Basically, in my opinion, this is my hypothesis. I mean, I want to know about your opinion. The way they're rewriting the history is that to promote, I would say that the dynasty of Muawiyah, Yazid and the rest, the Bani Umayyah, and glorifying them and saying that they are basically history has not been just to them, so they are trying to rewrite history. And
history has not been just to the Umayyads.
To the Umayyads, to Muawiyah and Yazid. So and now even in this particular country, you cannot find a single Malay by the name of Muawiyah. But recently somebody said that he wanted to name his son as Muawiyah, and he named himself as Abu Muawiyah. So it's kind of, to me it's subtle, but this is to me is very.
Did you ask him why?
No, but
I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's very unpopular. It's a very unpopular name, and to me that people have forgotten about the deeds of these Bani Umayyads and especially Muawiyah, and I think people have forgotten about story of Abu Dhar, for example, when he went up to Muawiyah. This was narrated by Ali Shariati, and once again Abu Dhar, when he says that oh Muawiyah, if this palace you're building is from your own money, it's extravagance. It is from the money of the people, is treason. So that's the kind of pious predecessors that we're talking about. People who are really down to the earth. Not like the Saudi kings nowadays. But now we are trying to rewrite history and to say that these are the pious predecessors. you have to, like what you said just now about being obeying the ulil amr, for example. So, and this has been used by Najib, the previous prime minister, who was dethroned by collaborating with what we call as the young ulama in this UMNO, the political party, the ruling party of Malaysia at the time, by saying that to become a pious Muslim, like the pious predecessors, you must obey your ruler as long as they perform salah. As long as they perform salah, you have to obey them. So that's the kind of mutual agreement between them, and I think is something detrimental to the Muslim world. So I just want to know what's your opinion.
In general, the jurists promoted political stability, and unless there was an overwhelming reason for deposing a legitimate ruler, they actually often opted for the status quo, right, in the interest of political stability. That's not unusual. I think in many ways it's the business of jurists to promote that kind of social stability and to promote the security of the state. I mean, I see that over and over again when I study the sections on the military jihad. The overwhelming concern was to defend the boundaries of the state and to protect the security concerns of the state, which is why they often sound a lot more hawkish than theologians or ethicists writing about jihad. There is a reason for that. And part of the problem is we often privilege the legal literature over other kinds of literature as if that's the only source or only genre that we need to be concerned about when it comes to the Islamic tradition, and therefore we get a very skewed perspective. So most jurists, understandably, I think, sided with legitimate authority. They did not want to promote chaos and instability in society. However, having said that, I think we also have to realize that they also had great concern for people who had genuine grievances, and they recognized the right of people to rebel against a really tyrannical authority, and they regarded that as a God-given right. Because ultimately rulers had to hold themselves accountable to the people. Remember, typically the ulama played an oppositional role to the government. Even though they upheld legitimate authority, they also represented the interests of the people, the general population, right? Most of the pious ulama are on record as having said they did not want to taint themselves with accepting an official position or working under any ruler. I think intrinsically saw political authority as ultimately corrupting. That's not necessarily true today, right? Because we have state-appointed ulama everywhere, all over the Islamic world, who owe their loyalty now to the government. And that's what Al-Azhar, which for the longest time was seen, of course, as the bastion of learning, but also of independent-minded ulama who did not owe their positions because of the largesse of the government. They could speak their mind, and they were respected by the people for their independent moral authority. That's no longer the case. They're usually dismissed now as spokespersons for the government, and they have very little credibility among the population. This has created, unfortunately, a huge vacuum in religious and moral authority in the Islamic world. And so nature abhors a vacuum, right? So the so-called fundamentalist leaders, ill-educated, not classically trained most of the time as scholars, were beginning to fill the vacuum because they could speak the language of the people and they could couch it in a religious idiom which sounded very credible to these people. So I absolutely agree with you, we have a huge problem. But the remedy to that, I believe, again, what I had stated earlier, is to reconnect with that past, but in a historically credible way, to be aware of all the diverse sources within the Islamic tradition, to read beyond the legal literature, not reduce Islam to its fiqh. Yeah, it's not even the Sharia, because people are constantly mistaking the one for the other. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do to get back to sources, back to the first generation, which is why I think the Salaf will always remain very important. Otherwise, we have these ahistorical constructions of the Salaf that I think are very, very dangerous in the current period, because they simply portray their own perception of what the first century would have been like based on the Islamist construction of the present. And unless people know any better, they're going to accept that. They're going to accept that as historically true.
Since some people are going back to the as-salāf, so right now we're actually having a debate in Malaysia about a 40-year-old guy marrying an 11-year-old girl. And you know, the authorities over here, some Muslim authorities over here say, look, it's okay because that's what the Prophet did with his first wife. So, you know, just to tell you that even as we go back, you know, to try and reclaim this history, it's difficult for, I think, modern Muslims also, because how do you reconcile with that reality, right? That this was an underage marriage, even if it took place long ago, but it still is. And so
I find it amazing that people get so fixated on Aisha's age. First of all, we don't exactly know how old she was. If you look at all the different sources, you can actually come up with a broad range of years for her. I actually had to write an entry for the Encyclopedia of Islam, the third version, the third edition that's online. And now I've, of course, promptly forgotten my sources, but one of them did suggest that she would have been as old as 12 or 13 when she was betrothed, and then the consummation would have happened in her early teens. Again, we come back to that how versus why dichotomy. Okay, so the literalists, the absolutists, the hardliners are going to be fixated on, oh, well, you know, but the Seerah says, the Seerah does, Seerah Nabawiyah does say that she was 9 and then 12, and I think Bukhari has a hadith. So of course, Bukhari, you know, is, has a very exalted status among Sunni Muslims. But this is where I think the modernist approach to the sources could be helpful. That the hadith and the seerah should, of course, be considered secondary to the Quran. The Quran comes first and trumps everything else. And the argument that is being made is the Quran clearly says that a girl, a woman, a female has to give her consent, and she has to be of an age of rushd to be able to give her consent, right? 11-year-old girl has not reached that age of rushd. So here there's a discrepancy between what the hadith and the seerah are saying about Aisha and her marriage to the Prophet, and what the Quran says should be the normative conditions for a valid marriage. And then there's also the fact that we have no consistency on the reporting of Aisha's age. So my quick rejoinder to that is, why are we so fixated on Aisha's age and not fixated on the fact that this was a woman who was very powerful in the first century of Islam and who was otherwise a very positive model for Islamic feminism in the contemporary period, right? So the easy answer to that is, it's a very cheap way to malign the Prophet, to malign Aisha's marriage to him, and to allow certain men in the contemporary time who do want to marry underage girls, right? This is, of course, a problem in every society. These questions keep cropping up. There is no doubt that girls married very young, but then so did boys in the pre-modern, pre-industrial time. The idea was to procreate as soon and as much as you can. You need a little labor force in your household, don't you? Someone to, people to help you in the farms and so forth. The agricultural society had different needs. So there were economic needs that were pertinent to that time and place. Again, the how versus the why. So the why comes in. Are women not to be considered eligible for, you know, all kinds of positions today, for, you know, to have increased educational and career opportunities? The answer, I think most Muslims would say yes today. Even someone as very conservative as, have you heard the name Mutawalli Sha'rabi? Very conservative Egyptian preacher, very popular on television. I used to watch him at times when I would go to Egypt, and I actually thought he was a darling man. He spoke very engagingly from his heart to the people. Even he, conservative as he was Azhar educated, by the way, but he had a very folksy manner about him. Even he said that if circumstances dictate, women have the right to work outside the home, because your family comes first. You have to feed them, right? You have to clothe them. And that is a responsibility of equally the husband and the wife, right? So here's the why, and then there's the how. It's like, oh, well, here are the numbers. 40-year-old man, 11, we've solved the problem. We can do exactly that. That's a silly, irresponsible, and a demeaning way of approaching religion, of approaching a whole, rich and diverse tradition like Islam, and demeaning to the Prophet and the example he sets for Muslims, right? To say that that's the one example we're going to be fixated on when we don't have absolute hard facts about that event, where even the age of the person, even the age of the Prophet, cannot be ascertained with absolute certainty, right? 40, by the way, is a very, tropical number. It's a trope. 40 usually signifies maturity. We don't actually know that the Prophet was exactly 40 years of age when he received revelation. What it does show is that he was a mature man. Okay, 40 becomes sort of a metonym for maturity. You see 40 repeated many, many times throughout the literature. Abu Bakr gave away 40,000 dirhams. Why 40,000 dirhams? Do we really know at this late date, right, when the Seer was being written down? No, we don't. But we know that it implies a huge sum. So we also need to know how to read these sources. And we need to know the hierarchy of the sources. The Quran is the ultimate arbiter for Muslims. The Sunnah is very important to help explain the Quran, and the Hadith, and then the Seer and so forth. The Seer is not canonical. The Seer is not canonical. Ibn Hisham was rebuked by many of his contemporaries for including many factual errors and historical untruths. But why shouldn't he have? My rejoinder to that was he was a storyteller. He wasn't claiming to be a muhaddith, a hadith scholar. He was a storyteller. He's telling the story of the life of the Prophet, and he embellished it. He took poetic license with many of the details and features. But that's why I read the Seerah. It's entertaining. But it's not canonical, it's not normative, the way, of course, the Quran is, and the way reliable hadiths are. Okay, so we have to read our sources very responsibly. And we need to challenge these people when they reduce Islam to these historical reports that are highly contested. Okay.
That's it for tonight. So, if anyone would like to have a discussion after our discussion, you can engage our two professors, maybe over coffee after this, I don't know. Shuhaib brews good coffee, by the way. Okay, so thank you to everyone who attend tonight's meeting. And tomorrow we will have the launching of the book and a forum on the future of Islam, and we have Professor Asma, Professor Jeffrey, and Professor Clive Kessler as our guests for tomorrow. So thank you and have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you.